In this video, I wanted to draw a little diagram for you of the spinal nerves and how they exit in between the vertebrae. So in this diagram, what I drew here is the skull, and then the skull will be, this is the framework of the head, and the skull is going to have the spine connected to it, made out of first the cervical vertebra. They're going to be C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7, okay? And then there's going to be thoracic vertebra, T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, and then T8, T9, T10, T11, T12, okay? And then we're going to have the lumbar vertebra. So on the next page, I'm just going to continue from T12, L1, L2, L3, L4, L5. Then we're going to have sacral vertebra. Those are fused, but they have holes in them. So S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5, the vertebra of the sacrum. And this is going to be the tailbone. It's got like CO1, CO2, CO3, and CO4 sometimes. So like, kind of like fused together in one structure. Okay, and then the nerves of the spinal cord will exit in between each of these vertebrae. So the first nerve, the C1, right here in this diagram, will exit between the skull and the C1 from each side. So we're going to have the spinal cord inside, kind of like that. And from the spinal cord, so of course this is going to be like blocked by the intervertebral discs. I'm just going to omit them in this diagram to show you the spinal cord. So the spinal cord will be going through all of these vertebrae. I'll fill it in later. So let's start with a C1. So the first pair of nerves will come between the skull and a C1, so on each side. And this is going to be called C1 spinal nerves. So this is going to be our nerves of the spinal cord. So they're going to be called spinal nerves. So C1. The C2 will exit between C1 and C2. Then there's going to be C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, and finally C8, and of course on both sides. So they're pairs of nerves. There's two, one on each side, right and left side. So the first nerve will exit between the skull and C1, then the second between C1 and C2, and then so forth, and then the last one will exit between C1 and T1. It's going to be called C8. And the way they're named is that if you take a vertebra, so this is C1, the nerve above it, that exits above it, will carry its name C1. So C2 above C2, C3 above C3, C4 above C4, C5 above C5, and finally we have C7 above C7. And because we don't have cervical vertebra C8, the C8 nerve will exit above the T1 vertebra. So that's just how they're named. Okay. Then, so these are going to be called the cervical nerves. And then we're going to have the thoracic nerves, and there's going to be 12 of them. And there's also spinal cord continues through the thoracic vertebra as well. So it's going to go all the way down. I'm just going to quickly fill it in so it makes sense. Remember, the spinal cord will end around L2 vertebra, but the nerves will still continue exiting between the vertebra. Okay, so the first thoracic nerve will exit between T1 and T2. That's going to be called T1. Then there's going to be T2 nerve, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, T8, T9 nerve, T10, T11, and then I'm going to add the first lumbar vertebra here, this diagram, and that's going to be T12. Okay, so there's going to be 12 thoracic nerves, of course, on each side of the spinal column. And the way they're named is going to be a little bit different than the cervical. It's going to be kind of like the opposite. So the nerve T1 is going to be below the T1 vertebra, as opposed to how the cervical names were. The C7 was above C7, so C7 nerve was above C7 vertebra, but in thoracic nerves, the nerve is below the respective vertebra, named the same. So T1 below T1, T2 nerve below T2 vertebra, and so forth, and then all the way to the end. So T12 nerve will be below the T12 vertebra. Okay. So that's going to be 12 thoracic nerves. So 8 spinal cervical nerves and 12 thoracic spinal nerves. And to continue with the lumbar nerves, so we're going to continue here on the separate page because it doesn't fit on one page for me. Okay, and then the nerve that we already drew was T12 nerve below the T12 vertebra. Now we're going to have lumbar nerves, named the same way as the thoracic nerves. The nerve named L1 will be below L1 vertebra. There's going to be L2, then L3, L4, and then L5. So our last nerve is going to be below the last vertebra of the lumbar region, so L5 below L5. Then we're going to have sacral nerves, S1 below S1 vertebra, S2 below S2 vertebra, S3 below S3 vertebra, S4 below S4 vertebra, and S5 below S5 vertebra. That's going to be between the last sacral, so vertebra between sacrum and the coccyx, and of course on both sides of the spinal column. And then there's going to be last nerve, CO1, and it's going to exit between the CO1 and CO2. It's a really small nerve, the coccygeal vertebra.